Welcome to TradeTheMBI.com. This is John. This report is for the 2nd of August, and well, it was fun. I gotta say, the excitement of these kinds of moves and this extreme volatility was quite dramatic, particularly coming exactly at the point we've identified here, right around our 55, 59 range. You get a slight move above it and that, but it becomes a centralized point where the algo began its original movement. And once you have that, for us, it's fairly simple. Below this level, it's like short, and obviously it was even cleaner on the 50K chart that we'll look at later. But MBI White continued to remain above. You had the brief period where Magenta was moving forward. It just wasn't enough to carry through, and you continue to see a massive amount of short increase flying through there with that cyan dipping well below the zero level and overtaking both the strong spike of steel. Short-term buyers, whatever they were doing, they just kept applying and were getting beaten to a pulp, literally. You can see it's even continuing to start in the day, and that's just because you threw a monkey wrench into expectations, because everyone thought, well, rates are continuing to decline. Where's money going to go? It's going to go to the market. But there was certainly enough liquidation force taking place that really caused disturbance overall. So not too unexpected. I mean, you can see that we have rather difficult economic times ahead of here, and it's just been a question of the reality between what happens when you have this yield continuing to decline, and that's where money tends to be going right now into treasuries, as bizarre as that is. The expectation is that, I guess inflation is going to zero and you have no issues. But when you look at oil, that ain't happening. At best, you're not having as dramatic an increase, but you're not seeing deflationary pressures in any way, shape, or form. In fact, you're seeing more stagflation than anything, which is uncommon for most. And unless you're old enough, you would recognize it, because that hasn't happened in several decades. I remember it. That's how old I am, but that's another story. From a euro standpoint, of course, yeah. We talked about this, and this is the central banks that have to get involved, because they have to maintain support levels for this. Otherwise, it just gets ugly, and then you create systematic failures, and you can't have that. It doesn't mean that it's not going to continue to be under pressure, because again, they got to buy dollars to trade for commodities, and that's the power of the dollar. So as much as everyone whines about the dollar, that's why it's such a serious threat when you talk about BRICS and them trading outside of the dollar for commodities. Yeah, and it's a real thing. And as I promised you, gold skyrocketing off this. So there's no way that it isn't going to continue, and it's definitely going to break 3,000 and continue from there. To suggest otherwise is just fantasy. From a Bitcoin standpoint, that again, like we've talked about, there are other issues related to this, but it is also going to be a secondary motive for people to bypass devaluation and negative yields if you're buying treasuries, because that's a great investment. From an ETH standpoint, also the same, and they're just suffering from the same kind of withdrawals. And that happens too when there's significant market declines. People have to liquidate hedge positions and that to cover it. So here we go for a 50K. I mean, it doesn't really get much cleaner from that standpoint. Right at the algo level, we turned red. That was up at 55.76, and it just was MBI White leading it. And this is an interesting one, because we talked about the spike that took place here, and it was just a matter of waiting that spike out. So that started with positive extremes. So you had your level right there, that your expected return value. And we continued to proceed outside that with Magenta going, and then it started to fade a little bit, and this was kind of muck, but you didn't have enough MBI White to really accelerate that, and that continued across for a little bit, making successive highs, but the Magenta continuing to stay cleanly above. Where it transitioned was right here, where you had the MBI White clearly taking over, and that resulted in the red. And it was just a straight down. There was nothing to do. That was it. You just stop and watch. Even when we ended up with the pushback towards the 23%, MBI White spiked again, and that was a clear indication you're going back to zero. So nothing to even think about in that one. And sure enough, it's just a question of how high can you collect your opportunity to jump into the short. And here you go. We're down another, 57 right now in European trading. So it's a little bit behind. So this is what it looks like currently right now. And you can see the decay. But if we go back to yesterday's action, fairly clean. Yeah, I would call that clean, at least from our pink bar, simply because it just stays with that trend and it's not going to stop. And that took place all the way up there, 55.84 range from 5, so just a fraction ahead of where the 50K did, tiny amount, and just didn't stop. And nothing really taking place in the post market, which is very interesting that bulls usually do that lift up. So this means that you had a huge option push to the call side of the environment, and they just got obliterated. And that's money that gets wiped out to the put side of it, which is to the dealers, because they had to pay counterparty to it. So they're very happy. And this will happen when they get caught upside down for this or that week, and that they make up for it in a more exacerbated move. And this is something we've been talking about for some time now. This interesting. You might want to call it bifurcation, moving towards options as the primary driver of where market conditions go and how upside down dealers are relative to the crowd trade. And it makes a difference. So keep that one in mind, but it's not really relevant as much as to just following the readings. I mean, you stay with the red on that, and it's about as easy as it gets. So not much else to add to it. That makes it simple. And I would just say that we're going to have more of this. It shouldn't be to this degree, but as things continue to be uncertain, and of course, this is where we were talking about the political side of it, the unwinding of Trump expectations versus now the thinking that Harris can win. That throws things into all sorts of chaos, because people have to then keep changing where they think that things are going to end up in another 100 days. Yeah, that's where your volatility comes from, because the polarity of between positions and what they plan to do economically is diametrically opposed. So you have to completely reverse. They're two very different viewpoints on how you would treat economic activity. So, as always, anything relevant, I'll put in the Skype chat. There was nothing relevant about this. It was all pretty straightforward and clean. So, have a good one. Trade well. We'll talk again later.